Niamh a gaeilge, Niamh ó Bitesize Irish in Shaw. Hello and welcome. It's lovely to be back after our short winter break. And we're starting 2025 with a very timely discussion of St Brigid, or St Brigid, as we say in Irish. So joining me today is probably the best possible guest to speak on this topic. It's Dr. Niamh Wycherley from Maynooth University. And Niamh, can I start you?
Tón Gimach, gur margus, agus who féin?
Oh, tá mé go bra, gur míle maithagad. And I should say also that Niamh is host of the excellent Medieval Irish History podcast. I'm a subscriber and listener myself, and it's phenomenal. There's a lot of episodes to listen to now, where Niamh is talking to lots of guests about topics from Irish history. And we might get onto that again in a little bit. But first of all, Niamh, could you tell us about yourself? So where were you from yourself, and how did you end up getting interested in medieval Irish history?
Thanks, Neil. I'm from Cork, but I've been in Dublin. I live in Dublin, and I've probably been in Dublin. Actually, I think I have been in Dublin now longer. So the accent doesn't really come out unless I get angry, excited, or I've been talking to my dad on the phone. So I studied in my undergrad in UCD, and then I actually ended up, so I was doing history and politics. And when it came, you do your 3-year arts degree, and it's a brilliant grounding actually. And I would recommend everybody tell your kids or whoever, it's great to do 3 years in a general degree like arts, and you develop critical thinking. You develop so many skills that you are absolutely transferable that you can apply to so many other things. But I decided I was going to do, it was a bit of a swat into the studying. And I decided I was going to do a master's, and I could have I was really into politics, and I could have done a master's in politics, or I could have done, there were brilliant ones in modern Irish history as well. And I chose to do one in medieval studies because I was amazed, especially in relation to Ireland, I was amazed how few scholars, how few academics there were working on the most famous epoch in Irish history, which we saw globally around the world, and which I was surrounded by growing up, and everybody else in Ireland was surrounded by growing up. Evidence on the landscape, and obviously St Patrick's Day and St Brigid's Day and shamrocks and high crosses and round towers and Skellig Michael and Clonmacnoise and Glendalough and everything. There's shockingly few people working on it, so I wanted to look into that. And I was also really interested in the development of the church, because that was something that was hugely influential in society, and how the church was formed in Europe, but also how it was formed in Ireland. So I did a MA in medieval studies, then I did a PhD on the cult of relics, and then a few postdocs, and now I'm a historian in the Department of History and the Department of Early Irish in Maynooth University.
Fantastic. And we were chatting just before the record, folks, and we discovered there's maybe a little bit of overlap going back, but you took a module or a course in Old Irish too at one point?
Yeah, so I studied, so I was in, as I said there, kind of all my training really was in UCD, and I was in the history department there, but there's obviously a brilliant School of Celtic Studies as well, and Professor Patricia Kelly. I studied Old Irish with her, as we discovered you did yourself.
Yeah, I did a bachelor's degree and master's with Patricia Kelly a long time ago now, but those were great days, and I found it was great training and great. Although Old Irish is very different to modern Irish, it really gives you a deep understanding of how the language works. So remember.
Well, I love etymology. I love the development of terms and the meaning of words. I still do now, even. I'm in a university, and I'm a humanities scholar. So, even the use of certain terms in an email, right, or in a document, the force of language is important. But it's just, I love the historical evolution of all languages. And this is one of the really cool and fun and interesting things about studying Irish medieval history as opposed to other jurisdictions, is that the texts are written, we have Latin texts and we have Old Irish texts, and sometimes you have the same topics discussed in both languages in different texts. So you get to compare the language, and you can see how, I mean, as we all know, languages aren't directly translatable, and there's a lot of interpretation and intent and force of meaning. And it's great that we have so many, while other jurisdictions at the same time, let's say if we drop down in, you know, the year 700 in what we might now call Western Europe, you had a lot of texts written in Latin, but in Ireland they were also writing in Irish, and just to the extent that you just don't get elsewhere. So it's just great to just use the language.
We have this boast, don't we, that Irish is the oldest vernacular literature north and west of the Alps. There's a lot of qualifiers there, but basically not many other people are writing in their own language as well as Latin.
Yeah, and I suppose they were, right? But what our kind of boast is that you just had a greater volume, especially in relation to, let's say, legal texts, legal material. It was really important to the Irish from the get-go that they were going to innovate and copy texts that they were importing Latin texts to translate them into Irish, but also to innovate in Irish as well. So yeah, so it's cool. So they were doing it elsewhere. It's just that we have a huge volume.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, let's get to our main topic for today then, which is St Brigid, or Féile Bríde, as we say. So what can you tell us about St Brigid then? She's one of the patron saints of Ireland, of course. But do we know anything about the historical person?
Yeah, so like when you were asking me there to give a bit of recap, which I wasn't really expecting about my own history, the thesis that I decided to do for my master's, so you know, you get taught modules when you do a taught master's, and then you do your own you know, extended kind of written thesis, and I did that on Cogitosis's life of Brigid, and funnily enough, I did get a few scholars kind of saying to me, oh, you know, does anybody, just another thing on, you know, like St. Brigid or St. Patrick. And I was incensed. I was like, there's so little, considering how much was written about St. Brigid in the Middle Ages. It is shocking how, you know, how much is written about her now, you know, from a historical perspective, to the extent, Neil, that we somehow have gotten conned into thinking that she didn't exist, right? So the historiography of how we've gotten to this place is fascinating. But I can tell you that in the Middle Ages, she was very much so a real person. And there's two different things happening here, and they're happening in relation to all historical figures, okay? There's the actual, and Bridget is no different. There's the actual life of the person themselves, and then there's how they were remembered. And both of them, actually, in a way, to me, as kind of an early medieval Irish historian, how people are remembered is more important, because I want to know about those communities and about those authors and everything, which is why I chose Cogitosis, right? I wanted to get into his mindset. Why was he doing this? You know, who was paying him? What was he trying to achieve? What was he saying? What were his exemplars, right? But in the last few years, because Brigid has now blown up and so hot right now, we have a new bank holiday, we have a new public holiday in Ireland on the first Monday of you know, every February, which is great. And also we've been in Kildare especially, but all around Ireland, we've been commemorating, and actually the world, we've been commemorating 1500 years, her 1500th anniversary. So the anniversary of the traditional date of her death in 524, you know, around then, right? But I think it's really important that we understand the difference between those two things, and that's not some weird ancient quirk that is relevant to famous people today, right? So there is a difference between someone's public persona and the way they actually are if you hung out with them every day. And even people who give us loads of access to themselves online, or have autobiographies or biographies or Netflix documentaries, you'd need to actually to know what they're really like and their personality, right? You know, so I'm kind of like, so Brigid, she's the same. you know, as all of any famous person that you could talk about now. And again, you might say, so some people are famous today, they do give lots of access to them, and some of them are really closed off. They're like, I'm an actor, that's my job, and you're not going to know me, and my friends know me, right? So we have to understand Bridget and all of the people from this time period in the exact same way. And I don't think because it's so far, you know, back in history, and because we have so few sources surviving from the time, full stop, we're never going to be able to know what she was actually like, right? But what I do is I look at the multiple contexts in which she was functioning to arrive at a kind of a likely idea of what she might have been like. Okay, so for example, so first of all, she was definitely real, and we can talk about that a bit more later on if you want. But she is famous as she's a Leinster woman, right? So she's known in lots of different ways. But the things that you know, we know for sure, she's from a family. By family, I mean like a big kind of a dynastic group known as the Faughart, and then there was different kind of subgroups of the Faughart, and there was a kind of a big territory around Leinster, you know, of where they were active, right? One of them was kind of where Kildare town is now. Possibly more likely where she might have been from, might have been Crochan in now County Offaly. I should check that again because I haven't spoken about Bridget in a couple of months. And so, but it's in that kind of area, right? Okay, around Leinster, and she's very famously a Leinster woman, and she's always spoken about that way, always spoken about as part of this family, the Faughart. Now, at some point, she probably, as an individual, let's say if we're trying to get into the, you know, the real woman, she probably was well connected with someone who was, you know, able to kind of patronize her and give her land to build her first church, right? Or for her to kind of build up a following.
She may have been the daughter of a powerful leader, something like this.
Absolutely, right. She may have been, and I think it's likely that she would have been that. But we do know that St. Patrick didn't have any connections. You know, he was an outsider, and he founded loads of churches in Ireland, right? So it's not a absolute prerequisite, but it is the most common. So if we don't just look at Bridget and we look at all of kind of people who
Colin Killer's another one, and he was also from the more elite side too, wasn't he?
Yeah, and he's kind of like the famous like princely saint, like he was about as high status kind of as you could get, right? But most people would have been connected enough that someone, you know, they were associated with the land. And how we kind of know that as well is you see a lot of the genealogies, but also the people who are commemorated in the annals associated with different churches. You see that they're from the same family, right? So, you know, you kind of have ecclesiastical families, people who are kind of wielding the power and influence, and they're often connected with that original saint. Or if they're not genuinely connected with the saint, that's fabricated fairly early on. So that might be they might have been living in the 5th or 6th centuries. In the 7th or 8th centuries, this genealogy is the people who are running.
Her would have been a big claim to fame for them. It would have been a big
massive claim to fame. But the thing, what's interesting, what makes Bridget to me more real than a lot of these saints, and I'm studying loads of them at the moment. My big project is on Finian of Clonard in County Meath, and that's funded by Research Ireland, and you know, more to come about that soon. But what's kind of more real about Bridget is that it's really consistent, her connection with the Faughart, right? And she becomes a kind of a national and a global saint, but that's something that's always present, that connection. And she the women of Kildare up until the 12th century, not every single woman who runs Kildare, what becomes this powerful institution, but very regularly the whole way through, from the 6th century all the way to the 12th century. So for 600 years, you have the Faughart, and they're not a massively powerful family at all. You know, the Idunlinge, you know, are kind of the big political family, the big aristocratic family in the area. But the women who run Kildare, they come from the Faughart generally. It's a really consistent connection with Brigid. And you asked about kind of the earliest stories, and you said about we have this, you know, really early literature in Ireland. Well, the earliest literature that survives is about Brigid, right? It's not about someone else, it's about Brigid. And it's copious and it's continual, right? So the earliest stories that survive, Cogitosis is one of them, but we have earlier kind of like poems and songs. They're about Brigid mostly. She's, you know, one of their favorite subjects of all of these Irish authors, and that doesn't stop. That continues until me talking to you about this today, you know, and writing about Brigid today. People are composing. I've done so much work with different kind of community things, especially with Kildare County Council, and they've their Brigid 1500 and Spirit of Brigid now for 2025. And so I meet like local artists and collectives and kind of creative writers and lots of different people. Brigid continues to inspire, you know, art and creativity. And I love to see it because I mightn't agree with the interpretation. It might be the way I'd look at it, but it's to me, it's a direct line from Cogitosis to them, you know, and Cogitosis who, you know, I was studying so long ago. So
have done it at primary school. We've been there making the crosses when we were 5 or 6 years old. So still to this day. Yeah.
And we're so, you know, we're kind of famous in Ireland for, you know, being storytellers, for great actors, you know, for great literature, Nobel Prizes, you know, Booker Prizes, all this kind of thing. And, you know, Brigid was one of the first people to inspire, you know, Irish people, you know, that early art, you know, written, you know, compositions and stuff. So many were by Brigid. So it's her legacy.
Yeah. And are there any particular stories or traditions surrounding her that appeal to you, any that you enjoy specifically?
So you have to keep it tight when it comes to the subject of Brigid, because we could go on forever. And so when I'm asked that question, it's not really about a particular story like the cloak on the plains of, you know, Kildare and thing. It's that there was, you know, Brigid, and I know it sounds trite and people think I'm just talking in sound bites sometimes, but she is kind of like the original influencer and, you know, founder, right? Big, you know, we're big into big company founders and everything. She founded the Church of Kildare, and that went on to become arguably the most powerful institution in the country, depending on who you're talking to. And Armagh are going to argue with that contention, but one of the most powerful institutions in the country for 600, you know, 700 years maybe. And people were trying to emulate her. I mean, this is the thing about saints and about, so Cogitosis is the life of a saint. It's this genre known as hagiography. It's a literary genre. They're not biographies. What you read in a life of a saint isn't what anybody thought actually happened. They're stories that are meant to, you know, expound moral doctrine and show kind of the example of the ideal Christian life. So people were trying to emulate Brigid and be like her. So what's that if not an influencer, right? So I'm not just being kind of trite in that. I believe that. So that's what appeals to me mostly, that you have a woman who is one of the most famous people, right? So it's a big deal to me.
I have a couple of questions about that, because we have, for anyone listening or watching, there could be people who are not aware, but there are hundreds of saints in Ireland and Irish history. There were saints in every parish almost, it felt like. But there were three big ones, really, we consider. Three were called patron saints, I would say. So there's Patrick, of course. There is Columcille and Brigid. So could you tell us anything about how did Brigid come to occupy that space? I mean, was it because of the political power of the Faughart in Leinster, or was it something about her own? Is there any indication of why she was one of the most beloved?
Yeah. Again, there's probably many different correct answers to that question, and by correct I mean none of it can be proved anyway, right? So you know, maybe arguable answers. So the name, I suppose, if I kind of go back a little bit, part of the reason why people argue that Brigid perhaps, wasn't real was that she shares a name with a pre-Christian goddess, okay? The goddess Bríde, which again, historians debate, what do we know about the goddess? I think there probably was a pre-Christian goddess called Bríde. The problem is we just don't have any historical evidence for it, okay? So in this famous text called Cormac's Glossary, which is kind of an etymology explaining the meanings of different words, Cormac, he explains multiple different Brigids. So there's the Christian Saint Brigid, and there's also this goddess Brigid. Now, in fairness, this isn't written down until much later. Like exactly. Thanks. It's a 9th century text. So we can't use that as evidence for anything that was happening in, the year 500 or 600. So Brigid apparently died about around the year 524. Okay. And Patrick apparently was active, maybe kind of a generation or half ahead of her. Right. So in a lot of the text, they're seen as crossing over. I'm sure they never met each other. But them crossing over would kind of make sense chronologically. Okay. If we just wanted to put her in that context. Now, so part of the reason why she became so famous could be an association with that pre-Christian goddess, right? I don't necessarily have any issues with that. My issue is when people say she's either a goddess or a saint. And I'm like, she is neither, because depending on your religious beliefs, neither exist. What she definitely was a real woman doing the hard yards, converting people, founding churches. And she, so that there's enough evidence for me as a historian of that period that she was as a real individual. Did her fame grow though because of association, perhaps like a name association with that goddess? Perhaps, right? As I said, I don't have any issue with that. But
which is maybe oversimple, I don't know, but possibly it's just a name that was in use, Brigid, or a title or something like that. Could there be some element of that in it?
Yeah, and you might be onto something saying a title rather than a name, because we had this big conference in Maynooth last September where we had all the many of the academics at the forefront of kind of Brigid studies from around the world, and they came to Maynooth, and it was open to the public, and it was brilliant. And one of the papers was from Professor David Stifter, who's in my department here, the head of the School of Celtic Studies here in Maynooth University, and he really dug into how the language works and the linguistics, and whether you would have someone called Brigid, whether you would have like a little girl called Brigid. And he was a little bit inconclusive about that. We're publishing the proceedings of that, and that book is going to be out next January, hopefully, with Four Courts Press. And I have to kind of go through his written version with a fine-tooth comb. But he left a little bit conclusive. But I think the weight of linguistic evidence was that you probably wouldn't have a little girl called Brigid. Now, you said title. Maybe though she became known as Brigid. Okay, and not necessarily because of a goddess Brigid, but because of what that word means, and that the goddess and the founder of Kildare, that name with that word, Brigid, and what it means, that's the reason, right, that she became known as that. Okay, or as you said, maybe
I have seen references that the br element at the beginning could be something which means high up or exalted, and I've seen that linked to words in Sanskrit, like Brahman, or even somebody mentioned Bray Head down in Wicklow here. But there are also links, Brigantia, I think, in Britain was the goddess over there. So it's not something which only in Ireland.
Yeah, and listen, and as far as I'm concerned, it just adds another element of complexity to us understanding this early period. So again, this period kind of when Ireland is famous as kind of the Isle of Saints and Scholars, and this period where you have pre-Christian Ireland coming up against the new Christian religion. right? And by that stage, you had many Christians in Ireland. So when I say the new Christian religion, I mean it like the church as an organized religion, you know, a kind of formalized from Rome. And I think we have in the past, and we continue to do today for no good reason. If there was a good reason, might have been a good reason before, but we keep on talking about historical periods in religious terms, and it's actually kind of daft, right? Because there's a lot going on at any given time, and if you drop down in the year 500, when Bridget was supposed to be active, and when she was active, I'm sure, around the area around Kildare, whether someone might have been like, oh, I'm just busy milking cows, or I'm, you know, busy fighting in battle, or whatever, giving birth to a baby, you know, lots of different things. And their religious beliefs, if they had any, may not have been the first thing that how they would define themselves. Yet we tend to do that as historians, looking back. And on that element, that question of pre-Christianity, we just don't have much evidence for what any pre-Christian beliefs might have been. So we have to be a little bit circumspect about how we describe it. And when we say that we make this fundamental mistake, and you'll see loads of articles now on the news and media and everything over St. Brigid's weekend, you'll have a lot of commentators, and they act like it's this binary. It's always there's this dichotomy, right? And it's a binary between paganism and Christianity, right? But we don't. Christianity has a unified system of beliefs that a group of men back in the late Roman Empire literally sat around a table and debated, right? And then at the end of the day, you know, like at the Council of Nicaea and stuff, they wrote down, so we believe in the one God, the Father. Okay, oh no, let's rephrase that. We believe in it. Right? They wrote it down, right? It's a codified system of belief, which uses, you know, which follows the Bible, okay, and a set of texts and the Psalms, all these different things. You can't then use that in opposition to your, say, paganism, in inverted commas, which, what do you mean by that, right? Because the term just means none, right? Just kind of, it's a term just other. To classify someone as different to yourself, right? And it's a kind of a pejorative term. It was a pejorative term then. I don't think it's a term that we need to reclaim or anything, because it implies that someone, first of all, it implies that people all had religious beliefs, and that someone, if I walked downtown there now into Maynooth, that everybody has some kind of, you know, thoughts on religion or faith, right? And they don't.
And the next county over, and the next county over. Yeah.
And the next right? Okay. And so yes, you have that with the Catholic Church. It's you subscribe. You literally stand up there en masse and say, this is what I believe in. You all recite, right? This is what we believe in. But what someone who isn't a Christian in Tyrone, right? Okay, in the year 400, and what they may or may not believe in might be completely different to someone in the year 500, 100 years later in County Cork, right? Down in West Cork, okay? And to just say it was Christianity kind of versus paganism, it really, what we're doing there is we're squashing all the nuances and complexity of these medieval people, you know, or of these, however you want to classify, people of the time, right? And that does a disservice, you know, to what was going on. So to get back to kind of the Bridget, the saint and the goddess, it's just really, we have a lot of texts which enunciate what the saint meant to people, right? So let's say Cogitosus is the life of St. Brigid. We have other lives of St. Brigid. They make quite clear what the St. Brigid was to them, okay? We just don't have the same idea and evidence for what pre-Christian beliefs would have been. And I'm sure people believed in lots of things. It's hard for me to say what they are. We do get glimpses. I mean, I think we can take a fairly good bet that sun worship, you know, the veneration of the sun, that played some role. Now, whether that was the sun as kind of like a deity type figure, or whether it was just common sense and cop on that you're going to be governed by, you know, the sun comes out, right? And it's like, it just came, the sun is kind of like coming out in me there now. I'll hang my cloak on this sunbeam like Bridget.
Well, I always think about the likes of Newgrange, which is obviously very much pre-Gaelic. It's thousands of years before the Irish language, but it's facing due east, of course, because it faces the rising sun, as ancient sites used to do. And then there's a sense in the Irish language where the right-hand side is, the word for right hand is the same as south. So baked into the language is this idea that facing east is the natural, right way to be. But that was way before anything you might call Celtic or Gaelic or anything like that.
Yeah.
So it probably just a lot of these things, like you say, some common sense, people who lived in the natural world a lot more than we do in it today.
But I mean, it is definitely a revolutionary period, this kind of conversionary period, where a new big institution, because I have focused I kind of on both sides, especially at work on relics, where you have the church deciding that these are particular rules that we can follow in relation to the veneration of relics. And then we also have evidence of like devotional practices and pilgrimage ways and everything. So, there are often two things going on. There are grassroots movements, from the bottom up. And then you have decrees from Rome, right? Decrees from the Vatican, right? And both of those things, they now and back in this early medieval period, they sit together. They're happening at the same time. And it's just tricky to talk about pre-Christian or non-Christian, is maybe correct to say as well, non-Christian, because we just don't have the evidence. I'm not saying that didn't exist. It's just that it's trickier for us to we don't.
The kind of inherent messiness of it. I think we can see a good example in Christmas, because Christmas is mostly a Christian festival, but this whole winter festival thing has got very little relation to the Bible at all, or to the land of Palestine. So a lot of our Christmas traditions seem to be Northern European midwinter traditions. So the two, I don't know, maybe merged and cohabited, survived together over all of these centuries. So
and yeah, of course, right? And then you have cultures. This is also really important for us to remember today. Cultures meld and they evolve and they adapt, right? So you have the responses, you have individuals and individual bishops and stuff in different areas who are responding to local needs, and not necessarily, a bishop in Kildare may not have been acting the exact same as a bishop in what is now Germany or something. Okay, so especially in this period, it's not until kind of the later medieval period that you really get the Vatican being quite clear on, okay, this is exactly how the Pope behaves, this is exactly how just be kind of stricter about kind of procedures, right? So kind of the people overstate the uniqueness of Ireland, right, in this period, in which, and I would say Ireland was as unique and as the same as everywhere else, right?
You mean
we don't have to
prince and scholars aspect?
Yeah, and we were, listen, I mean, we were doing lots of amazing things at the time, but we don't have to. You need someone who has done an in-depth study on everywhere to be able to say, conclusively, right? So we don't have to put down what was going on in what's now Czech, Republic, or like by saying, well, Ireland was completely unique. It's like, well, how much do you actually know about everywhere else, right? And I'm sure there was lots of amazing things going on everywhere. So we were unique in some regards, and we were the same in other regards as everywhere. So there's just a lot of complexity going on there, and we don't, to make medieval history and figures like Bridget, to talk about them today or make them understandable to people today, we don't actually have to forget about all of that complexity. But or saying things, as I said, I get frustrated with the binary that Bridget, people will say to me all the time, oh, you work on Bridget, that's great, I love Bridget, but I don't like the Saint Bridget, I'm really into the goddess Bridget. And I'm like, okay, cool, that's absolutely fine. I'm all of these things exist, right? So the Saint Bridget exists, the goddess Bridget exists, the real actual Bridget, who's the one who I want to talk about, she also exists. And Bridget means different things.
And there's a third, isn't there? There's a kind of I don't want to say reclaimed, because that sounds like it was there in the first place, but there's a kind of reconstructed or just purely constructed kind of version of attitudes to those pre-Celtic deities and attempts at forming a kind of systematic religion that we know existed with Christianity. So there's a kind of modern thing.
And that's been going on. That actually happened quite, it was very orchestrated in the 1800s and near the end of that century with Gaelic League, you know, and Lady Gregory and different people who were, you know, the Gaelic revival, right? In which you know, Brigid was put forward as a, you know, kind of a non-partisan, you know, as an icon for everyone, for Protestants, for Catholics, right? For, you know, that she didn't just represent one community. Okay. And what that was relevant at that time. I don't think that's relevant now. But what I love about that is that actually Brigid has always appealed to many communities. So to go back to what you were saying about Brigid and Columkill, in a way, Brigid was more famous because she was a hero to everyone, and she wasn't typecast as one thing. And I think that's why she has such longevity today. Everybody can find their own part of her that they connect with.
And so you about one particular factor then, because something I've seen in recent years, like you said yourself, maybe there's been a bit of explosion in interest in Brigid in recent years. But one thing that I see these years is that around this time of year, we get lots of events in cultural centres and places celebrating Irish women in general. Yeah. And do you think it's particularly significant that this is not just another saint who happens to be from Kildare, but it's a female saint?
Well, what I find interesting is that on some of those lists, Brigid is either left off, again, because people don't think she's real, or it's like the goddess Brigid. And again, I think that Brigid she was a real person, but she's actually the most famous Irish woman of all time. So she should be at the top of all of those lists, especially when we consider her influence now today. And I over the last few years, I
suppose what would still be called by some people Muireann na Nail. Yeah. So this is the Virgin Mary of the Irish, which kind of shows how big a deal she was considered to people.
Yeah, and again at that conference, we had a brilliant paper by Conor McDonough on Brigid as Mayor of the Gael, and that article again is going to be in the proceedings next year, so I won't kind of repeat his stuff. But it's fascinating. She's such a key figure. But what I would like to say is that today, again, when people say to me what they love about her, and I haven't met anyone who actually does, especially women, but in general, just people love Brigid, and rightly so, because that's one of the things from those earliest stories, right? If we go back to the earliest stories, so she lived around the year 500, and then the first surviving stories are about 100 years after that. Okay, so if she reputedly died around the year 524, Cogitosis's life of Brigid was potentially written as early as around 650. Scholars will debate that forever and never come up with a very firm conclusion. But anyway, around the kind of the third quarter maybe of the 7th century. So there's a big gap there, the same as with all of these saints. So that's why it's hard for us to really dig into the real kind of historical facts about their lives, because so much of it is it's written so much later. But the stories are consistent. And they remain consistent. She was always just sound, right? I think everyone likes Brigid. There's no bad story about Brigid. There's no story where she's only speaking for you. She's speaking to her constituency. That's not my constituency. Everybody is included in the stories about Brigid. So
no copyright infringement.
Yeah. Well, that's another. Yeah, my Finian from Clonard is involved in that one. But she Alpha Johnson kind of coined the phrase patron of the powerless, and she was someone who worked for the disenfranchised, and that is still something that really resonates with us today. So she was someone who was trying to represent, the disenfranchised, right? The people who didn't have a voice, right? But she also, in the same thing, so you'll have stories about her, as I said, patron of the powerless, but then the next story about her will be, her negotiating with the King of Leinster, right? Or her negotiating with the bishops, her speaking to a synod of bishops, right? And she does, and that's not awkward in all of these stories. And it's by many different authors, right? And they all have different literary styles, but it's really consistent. It's really consistent that she is someone who was maybe a privileged person in society, maybe educated and, maybe articulate. She must have been fairly confident, wherever she came from, to function in this world, but that she also was constantly trying to help the needy, and she just was able to do that. And there's so much complexity to her. And I think that's why she was a real person. And as well, you were talking about why she's so famous. I've gone off on about 25 tangents, but politics is a big part of that as well. So we kind of got into perhaps the goddess of it all. She founded what became one of the most powerful institutions in the country. So the Church of Kildare, and the church fairly quickly becomes embedded in Irish society. And by the time we have any decent amount of surviving written sources, so the 600s, the church is already really well developed. It's not hugely clear the exact trajectory of how that happened. The 6th century in terms of written sources is a little bit fuzzy for historians. We just don't have the survival of the written sources. But in the 7th century, it's really sophisticated. And as we've said before, you have the brother of the king, or some kind of maybe aristocratic connection, bishops of the churches, or as I said, kind of well-connected individuals. So the church then, in terms of the law, you have the bishops their status is at the same level of the Rí Tuatha, the local kings and different things. It's really, we're talking about the church is completely embedded in society, in the power structures of society, okay? Now, you have a while where it's not clear which is the most powerful church in Ireland. And that kind of little bit gets fought between, and I'm probably being unfair to other churches here, but it's mostly been discussed as it's between Armagh and Kildare, and also with Iona, right? Okay, which is the main foundation, monastic foundation of Columkill, and it's off the coast of now Western Scotland. But if we really there's a lot of texts that are focused on the battle between Kildare and Armagh, and it seems that for a while there, Kildare might have actually been the most powerful church and had the strongest claim. Now, ultimately, Armagh wins out. And part of how they do that is they really push hard on Patrick as the patron saint of Ireland. And I won't get into too much of the details there, but what we see are in these texts we see Patrick and Bridget either working together or in opposition, or kind of this quite sophisticated negotiation between the churches, saying, okay, well, you have jurisdiction in this area, we have jurisdiction in this area, and they're working it all out, over probably decades. But Bridget is the Saint of Kildare, and they make a strong claim to being the Church of Ireland, partly because of their association with Kildare, not only that. And there we end up with kind of a thing where we have this triumvirate of Irish patron saints. But when you look at the fame of saints outside of Ireland, Bridget is by far the most famous.
Oh, really?
And there's no question about that.
No, I'm from the Armagh diocese myself, County Tyrone. Yeah. I may be biased, but we do see Patrick's Day marches around the world. But maybe in terms of actual worship and Christian veneration, Bridget was more.
The Patrick's Day thing, like it is today, is a relatively recent phenomenon. If you're a historian like I am, and who kind of like deals in the 600s. It's a more recent phenomenon if we were just looking at textual output or like dedications around Europe. You have Brigid everywhere, and you have lives of Brigid, so texts about Brigid, poems, prose, metrical texts, all sorts of things. Them being composed in different languages around Europe. You have Cogitosis's texts being copied all over Europe. You have like the Irish period. In the medieval period, right? So long before anybody cares. Yeah, I'm talking hundreds of years before anybody cares about Patrick's Day, right? So Brigid was the big deal, and we have so many dedications around Europe to Brigid. Much more, I think. I mean, I'd have to look up the stats.
I think in Britain there are quite a few places with Bride. I mean, there's Brideshead Revisited. But that was a place name, I think. And then in Scotland, there's definitely Bride places.
There's so many. And again, to keep harking on about this conference, but this is part of the reason why we organized it, was to actually have some up-to-date research on this. And again, that is going to be published. But we had a couple of papers on that, on the veneration of Brigid on the continent. We had Professor Jean-Michel Picard talking about it. We had from UCD, we had Professor Paul de Gorian from UCC talking about those elements. And yeah, anyway, so in the medieval period, so Patrick becomes ultimately synonymous with Ireland and synonymous with the Irish Church. And Armagh, before that kind of really happened, Armagh becomes the head church in Ireland. So while Brigid herself is her veneration is much more widespread and famous than Patrick. Patrick is one who becomes synonymous with the Irish, and then of course that's taken from the Irish, to America and elsewhere. But in some ways it's difficult to talk about Brigid without talking about Patrick, because when we're looking at the 7th century, so Cogitosus, he says, like Kildare, everybody flocks from even at this point, he says people are flocking from all over the country to Kildare, partly to take part in feasting and everything, but also to visit the tomb of Brigid and her Bishop Conlade. And Armagh is super awkward because they don't have the body of Patrick. So they're like, we don't have a big fancy tomb with crowns and gold, and this is a really lavish tomb in the 7th century in Kildare. The people are coming and oohing and ahhing at. Armagh's like, well, we have Roman relics, and we've Stephen and Lawrence and Peter and Paul, and we've lots of other things, and this is the reason why we don't have Patrick's body. But we have other stuff going on. And ultimately, the Ineal are the big political power in Ireland at this stage, and the Ineal are backing Armagh. And I don't want to. It's not as simple as the Ineal were backing Armagh, so they became the most powerful church. But it's an element, in understanding. And then the rest of the, I would say, right. So they're backing Armagh. Armagh's poster boy is Patrick. And the rest is history, right? And I haven't even gotten into feminism yet, Neil. But I do think that like her being a female saint, is a key element in all of this as well. But in a way, even now, she's become an avatar for people want inspirational female leaders. And even though they keep telling me that they're inspired by, some people are telling me that they're inspired by the St Brigid, and some people tell me that they're inspired by the goddess Brigid, and that's all absolutely fantastic. And I keep on responding, wait till you hear what the real Brigid did, because she is way more inspirational. Because this is a society in which women were explicitly expressed in the legal texts as not equal to men, right? And women, some of the texts, I mean, the misogyny that's written into the legal text and into lots of other texts is really like overwhelming. The stuff that's said about women.
For listeners and who may not know, in early Irish law, it wasn't a vague thing. There was a literal price on everybody, wasn't there? A literal value was assigned to different kinds of people, obviously very stratified society. So did women have literally half the value of their...
So within this, so that's it, like you've alluded to, this one important thing, and we've kind of been saying it implicitly, but this is a really hierarchical society. You have slaves at the bottom of various and the unfree, okay, and all the way up to kings and queens at the top, right? And it's not just that exists. This is clearly explained in the laws. So the laws explicitly say there's no equality in Ireland. This is the honour price and the legal status accorded to each person. And within that system, women have half the honour price of their closest male relative. So you can do the maths on that obviously a queen, right? So the wife of a king, or the daughter of a king, or the sister of a king, or whatever it might be, she has a relatively high legal status. So she has a higher legal status and a higher honour price and a higher position in society than a poor male farmer. Okay, so it's not just about gender, sex and gender. Its status is massively built into it. But any women aren't able to give witness testimony, in court cases and this kind of thing. And there are many, many, many different ways in which women are clearly delineated as less equal and less important. So
I feel, unfortunately, you get, in sort of pop culture, you get overblown notions of Celtic feminism and things where women could divorce their husband, and there was a lot more going on than some of those headlines that people have grabbed onto.
Absolutely, and it's why I think it's such an important message to convey, because what I'm saying is that within this world, Bridget becomes not only Bridget. So Bridget founds one of the most powerful institutions, but it's not as simple as she's just a made-up person, right? I can tell you, and you're just going to have to trust me, they would not have made up a fake female founder. It makes their life way more difficult. People like Cogitosis and the writers of different texts, they're struggling with the fact that it's a woman, because within their society that they're living in, women, have limited agency, right? Okay, so it would have made their lives way easier if it was a male founder at Kildare. But you don't have to take my word for it on that. The most powerful leader in Kildare at any given time is the woman, the abbess, or the domina, or the dominatrix, the woman of Kildare. And that continues until the 12th century. Okay, so if it had just been, oh, listen, we have this kind of famous goddess, and we have a lot of nice stories about her, with dogs and foxes and different things, and it's all nice, and we can kind of build up a whole saint around that, and the Mary of the Gael and everything. There's a lot more going on there, because if we're just talking we shouldn't, in relation to kind of women's studies, we shouldn't talk about soft power and and that kind of thing. But if we do want to talk about things like owning property and being able to sign contracts or that kind of thing within this legal system, as I said, the woman who is in charge of Kildare, so she's either termed the abbess or the domina, she is the most powerful woman in Ireland at any given time, between kind of 600 to 1150 kind of thing. Okay, so that is massive. That legacy doesn't flinch, right? So these women, and the reason why it doesn't flinch is because Kildare continues to be a powerful, a power player.
Yeah.
So and the woman of Kildare is recognized as that. So for a while she has an abbot as well, because it's a double community. You have male religious and female religious. But again, Cogitosus stresses in his text that Kildare is a place for everyone. Everyone of all genders, all status, everyone is welcome in Kildare. That's a message that resonates with people. That's why Cogitosus's text is copied so many times in Europe. It's such a popular text. But also you have a Bishop of Kildare, and that is stressed. The Bishop of Kildare is incredibly important. But the Bishop of Kildare, where he comes from in terms of dynastic families and affiliation, that changes over those centuries. But that whole element of the women of Kildare coming from the Fachert people, Bridget's people.
There was
That's consistent.
brand value, to use a modern term, there wasn't there. You know, it was, this is, I guess there was an association with the place and the particular group of people. And maybe without all of those associations, you know, for a woman to be so powerful in that age in Ireland would have been, well, very hard to achieve. But
Really,
but maintaining that, it must have been the brand value over the hundreds of years.
And also, these women were clearly, there was clearly a little bit of a, I don't know, like a generational thing that your auntie, your grandmother, your, you know, whatever, you know, that they were bringing up these women to be raising them, right? Yeah. To, you know, to be leaders. So there's a lot going on there. So it's not just Bridget's legacy is huge, and we're rightly remembering her as a feminist icon, but not necessarily for the reasons why people. But listen, remember her for, you know, whatever she means to you.
I do think it's a great excuse to give Irish women their due, because there's a lot of things in their history which are remembered, but not for the right reasons, as regarding women in this country. So it's a great excuse anyway, and she's a great figurehead for that, possibly. So Niamh, this has been fascinating, really amazing. So you have your podcast, of course. Yeah. I would really heartily endorse this podcast. As I say, you cover lots of different topics about medieval Irish history, and you're talking to different experts in each episode, isn't that right?
Yeah, so listen, ultimately, if the podcast runs for years and years and years, we'll get around to, you know, to most topics, maybe ultimately. But there's just a lot to cover. We cover all of the, you know, the big saints, because that's what I'm into. You know, we've a couple of episodes on Columbanus and Columkill, on Patrick, on Bridget, Bridget with the brilliant Professor Catherine McKenna from Harvard. That's a great episode. But then Queens, the Battle of Clontarf, you know, Murchatoch Rian. We've one coming out soon on the English conquest. And, you know, we'll be covering things like, you know, Strongbow and
I always find it funny how soon after Clontarf that the Norman conquest actually happens. It's, you know, between those two eras, they come really close together, just 100 years or something.
But it's all part of the same history, and it's all part of it. You know, you need to understand Clontarf in relation to what's happening in Britain and what's happening elsewhere. You know, it's all part of the same kind of geopolitical scene. We have, you know, episodes relating to Viking topics. I love the Vikings as much as everyone else does, and I teach mostly a lot of my courses that I teach in Maynooth are on the Vikings, because Ireland, the other thing that Ireland is famous for are Vikings. So you have the saints and scholars, but also Vikings.
And while he's still in the job, I'd like to mention an Tuchtran the Heron, Michael D. O'Higgins. So Michael D. Higgins, the president of Ireland, of course, the name Higgins, O'Higgins, that is cognate, isn't it, with the word Viking? So that was a Norse name going back. So, and
there's loads of great
Vikings. They reached the highest echelons here.
Yeah, and again, what we see then is, you know, we just see kind of like cultural integration and lots of things going on. So we kind of dig into all of the nuances of that whole medieval period in the podcast. So I interview a different expert every episode, and they're released. You can get them on Spotify or anywhere. Every
really good stuff, folks. If you're interested in Irish history at all, you know, dip in. It's really good because you get the real experts speaking too. Yeah. I'm an enthusiast. I love all this stuff myself, but I'm by no means an expert. So it's great to hear those voices. And you're there at Ulster Wanuad, aren't you, Maynooth University? You mentioned a few of your colleagues there in the School of Celtic Studies, David Stifter, people like that.
Yeah, and we've had him on talking about OM, the Owen writing system, and also about the early Irish language. The head of my department is Dr. Deborah, Professor now, Deborah Hayden, and we're going to be getting her on soon to talk about medicine and going to the doctor in the Middle Ages. And we have Elizabeth Boyle. She actually has done the first episode with me, both series 1 and series 2, talking about kind of what is medieval Irish history anyway, and also talking about literature and Cuchulainn and Queen Maeve.
I'm looking forward to that one about medicine, because my surname is O'Sheil, and that's one of the things. It was the Book of the O'Sheil was a medical text.
Yeah, I'll have to ask Neil. I'll make sure, remind me or email me whatever. I'll have to ask Professor Hayden when I have her on about that. But yeah, so everyone, you know, I'm obviously going to use I'm surrounded by so many experts in Maynooth University. Michael, so I'm in the Department of History now as well, and had Michael Potterton on about towns, and just actually recently a PhD researcher in the Department of History and Early Irish, Mairead Finnegan, gave a brilliant episode on fashion and clothing in later medieval Ireland, what people were wearing and why were they wearing what they were wearing. So yeah, we try to, you know, dip in and out of different topics, and you know, people can message us and email and stuff, and I've gotten a couple of emails about Kings, need more Kings content, but I was being contrary, Neil, and saying I'm going to focus on Queens, so I did like 5 episodes on Queens instead, but a few episodes on castles, and we'll definitely get onto castles, and you know, ultimately we'll cover everything.
So there's lots more to go to. That sounds
good.
Could I ask you about your relationship with the Irish language too? Because you were chatting before, and you definitely have the point of view of a lot of people who've grown up in Ireland.
Yeah, and like, listen, I'm lucky. I'm in the School of Celtic Studies. So my Department of Early Irish, we teach everyone through English, right? But you can learn Old Irish, and you can learn Welsh, and you can learn different and Middle Irish, different languages. But it's all taught through English, right? So it's kind of teaching the history and the culture and the language. But Nua gaeilge as well, right? Are my colleagues within the School of Celtic Studies. So I'm lucky that I'm surrounded by the Irish language all the time, right? And you know, there are people there teaching all the students through gaeilge, and when you're an Irish historian, obviously I have Old Irish for the texts, so the texts are written in Old Irish and Latin, but my modern Irish is terrible now, right? Because I haven't been using it, and so while I'm listening to it, I'm not speaking it myself, right? And I haven't, and that's okay. I'm not going to be too hard on myself, because you know, I'm busy. But it is a gorgeous language, and I want to be fluent again, right? But I talk to a lot of people, and people of my generation and everything, who grew up in Ireland. And listen, a lot of people don't have a great relationship with the Irish language because of the way we were taught it. And I was saying to you earlier, Neil, there's 2 things about it. One, you can leave secondary school like I did, fluent in Irish, right? And that was, you know, my mum and dad were also fluent in Irish, right? You know, so I was okay. But I lost it all because I wasn't using it. You know, I was talking in English, and if I was also pretty fluent in French, but anytime I went to France, I actually used French, right? Whereas I didn't really have a reason to be using modern Irish. And, you know, it's a muscle like anything else, and it atrophies. And if you're not, if it's not something that kind of you're using regularly, it's, you know, it's hard to keep on top of it. So even if you left school and you had a good relationship with it, if you're Irish, right, by the time you're my age, it's all gone, right? You know, you have the cúpla focal, and you have a number of phrases that stick in your head, and you might think in Irish sometimes, or for some reason I always refer to water as ishka. I have no clue why, and my kids always use the word ishka, and I think that's the only word. And but anyway, it obviously stuck in my head that that's the only word for water is ishka. But there are things that might stick in your head, but you've forgotten all the Irish, and that's fine. But people are embarrassed about it because they feel a bit of, I suppose there's a kind of a hangover, a colonial hangover, right? That we were forced to speak English, and we kind of feel like we have to defend that, right? That we have to defend, well, I know I'm speaking the language of the empire, you know, but you know, I was taught really badly, and I think we have to get over all of our hang-ups on that, because it means that nobody will talk to me about it then. You know, they're like, oh, listen, I hate Irish, you know, I had to do Pass Irish in my leaving, and my, you know, I felt bad about that because I was doing honours and other subjects, or, you know,
well, like whatever. I say, it's one of the most typical groups of learners inside Ireland. It's the most typical group of learners inside Ireland is people who are returning and there's always this riot of conflicting emotions. People have this graph for the language, and they do have pet words. They use like ishke or ganzi or things they love to say.
Guna.
Or the madra or whatever it is. But there's a bit of shame, and there's a bit of just bad feelings and a little bit of bad memories from, you know, I don't know, maybe people were made to feel a little bit stupid at school. All of those negative things, which do not help. But happily, we have a lot more opportunities for these days. I mean, Bitesize Irish is one, but we've got things like our pop-up gaeilge and a lot of just the atmosphere has shifted a bit, I would say, in the last 10 years. And there's a lot more. We're now regularly sending Irish language movies to the Oscars. So that is a big change.
Yeah, you know? Exactly. And Kneecap, like, I mean, that movie. And it was just, for someone like me, right, it was so lovely to just listen to just be able to let and obviously on Colin Kewan and everything, you know, you can let the language wash over you, and you don't have to get lost in the plot details, because, you know, you can read the subtitles.
One of the big barriers is getting Irish out of the classroom, and not treating it like a museum piece where we've got to be very gentle with it. Now, Kneecap are not really subtle or general about anything like that. And in Colin Kewan, what I loved about that film was that it's not about the Irish language at all. It just happens to be in Irish. So we don't always have to be discussing the state of the language. We can just be expressing ourselves.
And I think people outside of Ireland, because a lot of the scholars that I work with, especially like we've just this amazing international department in Early Irish and Maynooth, people are coming like from all over the world to work in this period of history and learning Irish and Old Irish and everything. But people don't realize that we were taught Irish in school as we were taught it the same way as English, as if it was our native language. So, and I have that now with my girls, and they are doing class, and God, make this really clear, the teachers are absolutely not at fault, and the teachers are brilliant, but you're teaching kids who are speaking in English all day and speaking in English at home, and you're teaching them Irish through English. And if you go, you know, to a Spanish class, you walk in the door, and I'm sure how you would do classes and everything, and you immerse yourself in the language for while you're doing it. But that's not how Irish was taught to us in school. It's not how it's continued to be taught. It's actually taught through English, and you study the poetry and you study all the literature and you analyze it at a really high level. But you don't do a lot of just speaking Irish for an hour and kind of going out and playing in the yard and having to say pass the ball and all of those kind of things in Irish, which is kind of how you teach kids French and Spanish and different languages. So and it's only when you go to Irish college for 3 weeks in the summer, you know, when you're 13, 14, 15, that you really start to use the language. But up until that point, it's a subject. It's not taught as an immersive kind of experience. So,
well, I had the opportunity a few years ago to ask. I was curating a very well-known Twitter account at the time for 1 week, and I had the opportunity to ask that question: what does it mean? It's how it's taught. Because I'm from Conde Chiron, Mahane. I didn't have the same system. We had no Irish in primary school. And it was taught to us like French was taught to us in secondary school.
Okay, interesting.
For me, I thought fab, and I loved it, and you know, it served me well. But one of the things I heard was that a lot of people felt that when they went to secondary school in the 26 counties, that they were treated as if they were already speakers who were confident and proficient in Irish, and really they needed the basics of conversation again. So,
but even. Yeah, anyway, listen, we can talk about it another day. But then there are, like, I think the cool thing now as well is we're getting more exposure to the language. Obviously, you've people like yourselves, but even like in the Royal Irish Academy and Young Academy Ireland, I'm chair of that now. And, you know, we're trying to do more things, you know, bilingually, and for just to build the Irish language into the normal fabric of how we do things, you know, 100%. And that takes a while.
Yeah. But I think younger generations are a bit more comfortable with it too, given the number of people who've been to Gael Scullen and how cool the language is these days.
If you can get into a Gael Skull, Neil.
Yes.
That's the new big political issue. If you can get into one.
Just need to make them all gael scanna.
Yeah.
Well, Niamh, but while I'm still free to go that as a big Lord Slynn and you, thank you so much for your time and your insight. Once again, I heartily recommend liking and subscribing, but especially listening to the Medieval Irish History podcast. It's really, really good. And don't forget to check out all of Bitesize Irish's services if 2025 is your year to get to grips with the Irish language. We do have other conversations and courses which are relating to these cultural topics too, the old festivals, and singing in Irish too, of course. So Niamh, gurda míle maith.
Lá Féile Bríde, honna Díobh.
Transform your Irish language journey in 1 week. Take the gaeilge gach lá 1 week challenge starting Monday. It doesn't matter if you're just starting off, coming back to Irish, or you're already an active learner. Go to challenge.irish or click the link in the description.